Hello and welcome to the Jacques Derrida of Grammatology ninth reading. Today we're going to be going over the hinge section from Linguistics and Grammatology, Writing Before the Letter, which is page 71 in the 40th anniversary translation. Already here, the name of this section presents us with something interesting, because in English it's translated to the hinge, but in French it is la brisure, B-R-I-S-U-R-E, which is an interesting word because it is used to represent not only a deviation in a rampart or something like this, some sort of deviation in a pathway or some structure, but also in heraldry, it is used to mark a difference, the difference between two heraldic marks, so that you know that somebody with a very similar heraldry isn't the same, right? It's used to differentiate some of these things. So already we're seeing some interesting wordplay from Derrida, which is his main thing. And he has a quote here from Roger Laporte in a letter that applies to this particular term. It says, quote, "You have, I suppose, dreamt of finding a single word for designating a difference and articulation. I have perhaps located it by chance in Robert's dictionary. If I play on the word, or rather indicate its double meaning. This word is brisure or hinge, a joint, a break, broken, cracked apart, breach, crack, fracture, fault, split, fragment, hinged articulation of two parts of wood or metalwork. The hinge, the brisure of a shutter." I'll continue here in Derrida's words now. Origin of the experience of space and time, this writing of difference, this fabric of the trace, which he talked about before as kind of being the movement of difference that makes it possible for us to experience the world and communicate and all sorts of things. The thing that comes before a metaphysics can be established permits the difference between space and time to be articulated, to appear as such in the unity of an experience, of a same lived out, of a same proper body. This articulation, therefore, permits a graphic, visual, or tactile, spatial chain to be adapted, possibly in a linear fashion, to a spoken, phonic, temporal chain. It is from the primary possibility of this articulation that one must proceed. Difference is articulation. This is indeed what Saussure says, contradicting chapter 6. Quote, "The question of the vocal apparatus obviously takes a secondary place in the problem of language. One definition of what is called articulated language might confirm that conclusion. In Latin, articulus means a member, part, or subdivision of a sequence. With regard to language, articulation can designate either the subdivision of a spoken chain into syllables or the subdivision of the chain of significations into significative units. Using the second definition, we can say that what is natural to mankind is not spoken language, but the faculty of constituting a language, i.e., a system of distinct signs corresponding to distinct ideas." End quote. The idea of the psychic imprint therefore communicates essentially to the idea of articulation. Without the difference between the sensory appearing and its lived appearing, mental imprint, the temporalizing synthesis, permitting differences to appear in a chain of significations, would not have been able to do its work. So this is already referring back to this prior section before I read that Saussure quote, this mingling of space and time presents an interesting question in that Derrida is saying that this is found in the we can locate this in the foundation of the relationship between language in initially in the first place. Um, in the sense that there's this graphic component, like the word is a representation of the spatial chain, and then it's adapted into a temporal chain, the spoken, right? Because to speak happens over a time frame. In order to speak now, it takes me time, right? But an image itself does not convey a time at all. It is just the image, right? It does not have a beginning or an end by default. But there's this relationship where they're seen to be transferable, and this is already, we can already see here the way in which the trace is kind of undercutting the spatial and temporal relationships that we seem to be working with. Does anybody have any questions or comments on that? I know in particular in things like philosophy of music, or sometimes the way that critics like to describe comic books or movies, is that they'll describe, even Deleuze does this, right, is that he'll describe um, them as a set of images and words, or in the case of music, right, sounds over time. It's always defined with regards to time, but in this way, it in some ways stops being spatial. Right? It stops being a visual or graphic form of communication in a certain sense when we describe it that way. And it's interesting that seems to hold precedence for film and comics as well. The images, for some reason, in analytic principles, seems less important than temporal things, which I think leans on like the phonocentric bend that society generally has. That the imprint is irreducible also says that speech is originarily passive, but in a sense of passivity that all intramundane metaphors would only betray. So he's criticizing Saussure, kind of relying on this Platonic idea of an inside soul, or capital I idea, right? That he seems to refer to as like this psychic imprint, logos, like speaking from the center of the self. We talked about this last time before, so I'm just going there quickly. This passivity is also the relationship to a past, to an always already there, that no reactivation of the origin could fully master and awaken to presence. This impossibility of reanimating absolutely the manifest evidence of an originary presence takes us back, therefore, to an absolute past. That is what authorized us to call trace. That which does not let itself be summed up to the simplicity of a present. It could, in fact, have been objected that in the indecomposable synthesis of temporalization, pretension is as indispensable as retention. So, pretension is something Husserl refers to. It is that moment of living present, right? Like when I look at the can, and the can is right in front of me, and the side of the can I'm seeing, or whatever, is part of pretension, right? And then retention is like what is retained about the can. Like, for instance, when I turn the can, I still remember that it has another side, right? I'm retaining it. And so what Derrida is saying here is that it could have been objected that in decomposable synthesis of temporalization, pretension is indispensable as retention. So perhaps he's saying here that you could contest. You could say that actually pretension is not as important as retention. Obviously, because of what he's doing with absence here, right? There is no living presence that we access, and he's kind of making fun of this idea of this thing, this absolute past of the psychic imprint, which has to fall to the description. He basically is fixing this idea of the psychic imprint and turning it into the trace, which isn't like a psychologicalism. And their two dimensions are not added up, but the one implies the other in a strange fashion. So again, he's talking about pretension and retention here. The two dimensions are not added up, but the one implies the other. What is anticipated in pretension does not disjoint the present any less from its self-identity than does that which is retained in the trace, certainly. But anticipation privileging, one would risk effacing the irreducibility of the always already there, and the fundamental passivity of what one calls time. So always already there is being hyphenated here. It's a term used by Heidegger, or already there, and always already. In German, they're allowed to combine. It's a typical German grammatical thing to combine words into one big word, like Torschluss Panik or something like that. Schadenfreude, another example. And so Heidegger would combine these words together. So always already there is one word, and the fundamental passivity of what one calls time. On the other hand, if the trace sends back to an absolute past, it is because it obliges us to think a past that can no longer be understood in the form of a modified presence, as a present past. Since past has always been signified present past, the absolute past that is retained in the trace no longer rigorously merits the name past. Another name to erase, all the more because the strange movement of the trace announces as much as it recalls. Difference, differs. With the same precaution and under the same erasure, it may be said that its passivity is also its relationship with the future. The concepts of present, past, and future, everything in the concepts of time and history, which implies classical evidence for them, the metaphorical concept of time in general, cannot adequately describe the structure of the trace, because everything that's stored in the trace is already seen as a present past, right? So it's already doing. We can't describe it through these temporal explanations because it itself is the motor of the way in which time is regarded, right? So it has to be a non-temporal description for the trace. And deconstructing the simplicity of presence does not amount only to accounting for the horizons of potential presence, indeed of a dialectic of pretension and retention that one would install in the heart of the present instead of surrounding it with it. It is not a matter of complicating the structure of time while still conserving its homogeneity and its fundamental successivity. By showing, for example, that the past present and the future present constitute originarily, by dividing it, the form of the living presence. So he is, I don't think it's in this book, but he did a lecture. It was one of his first lectures, one of his big main lectures. What's it called? Science, Structure, and Play in the Human Sciences, where he talks about the two types of futures, which I think is what he's alluding to here when he says past, present, and future present, right? So the past present is a recalling of the past. It's not the past because we're engaging with it in the moment, right? So it's a past present in a way. And then the future present, which is accurate predictions about the future. Because there are two types of future, says Derrida in that particular lecture. There is the future that is predictable, that will happen, which is not in the future. It's in the now, because it affects things now. It changes the way we think about things now. It changes the context that things are understood in now. And so it's not in the future. And then there's the future, the unpredicted future, which is the true future that he's not talking about here. Such a complication, which is in sum the very one that Husserl described, holds on in spite of an audacious phenomenological reduction, to evidence to the presence of a linear, objective, and mundane model. Now, B would be as such constituted by the retention of now A and the pretension of now C, in spite of all the play that would follow from it, from the fact that each one of the three nows reproduces that structure in itself. This model of successivity would prohibit a now X from taking the place of now A, for example, and that by a delaying effect that is inadmissible to consciousness, an experience should be determined in its very present by a present which would not have preceded it immediately, but would be quite considerably anterior to it. It is the problem of the deferred effect of which Freud speaks. The temporality to which he refers cannot be that which would lend itself to a phenomenology of consciousness or of presence, and one may no doubt contest the right to name as time, now, anterior present, delay, etc., all that is in question here. Any comments or questions on that section? Okay. In its greatest formality, this immense problem would be stated thus. Is the temporality described by a transcendental phenomenology as dialectical as possible a basis which the structures, let us say, the unconscious structures of temporality would simply come to modify? Or is the phenomenological model itself constituted as a warp of language, logic, evidence, fundamental security upon a woof that is not its own? And which, such as the most acute problem, is no longer at all mundane. For it is not by chance that the transcendental phenomenology of the internal time consciousness, though very careful to place cosmic time within brackets, must, as consciousness and even as internal consciousness, live a time complicit with the time of the world. Between consciousness, perception, internal or external, and the world, rupture is perhaps not possible, even in the subtle form of the reduction. So Derrida is attacking Husserl's phenomenology here, saying that if what Husserl is doing is reducible to a certain type of language, or reducible is probably the wrong word, but it's constituted and it's a warp of language, right? He's choosing to talk about things within a certain reduction. Then his idea of time consciousness, it's supposed to be like he says, mundane. Like it's phenomenology is supposed to be something that we all engage with, obviously, right? And then attempts to explain it maybe less mundane, but it is supposed to be mundane in the first place. But this warp of language that Derrida is talking about makes it no longer. It doesn't have the special quality of being mundane anymore, right? It's not this reduction isn't special. It's the same type of interplay of difference that we do for any subject. And so we can't now give phenomenology like a special place. At least with what he's saying here, I'm not sure if he'll correct or he'll add to that in a moment. And then he's also saying that while Husserl wants to move himself away from cosmic time, so there's this idea that time is happening outside of yourself, right? Like that stuff happens. There's like a universal time and order of progress that things take. Even though Husserl thinks he's avoiding this time consciousness that he describes with like a past, present, and future is subservient to this cosmic time, right? Whereas Derrida has kind of broken this relationship more uniformly with this idea of the trace, which doesn't depend upon cosmic time, right? It doesn't refer back to a cosmic or universal time outside of the self, because phenomenology is supposed to be entirely, that's the whole point of the reduction, right? Is that it's supposed to be entirely about the self, the internal experience, the phenomenal world, as it were. And so, there was kind of this problem, and Derrida has solved this problem. It is in a certain unheard sense, then, that speech is in the world, rooted in that passivity which metaphysics calls sensibility in general. So here he's talking about, again, he has a book called Speech and Phenomena that's informing much of what I'm saying here, that came out at the same time that this did. And he has a certain, I think I've talked about this before in this video series, but there's a certain relationship that Derrida associates Husserl with to speech, right? As enunciation, speech is something that goes across a medium. And for Husserl, this was the way in which you phenomenologically interacted with things, was across a medium. There was a required medium of pretension and retention that we've criticized before as also being abstracted by difference. Since there is no non-metaphoric language to oppose to metaphors here, one must, as Bergson wished, multiply antagonistic metaphors. Wish sensibilize is how Main de Biran, for example, with a slightly different intention, named the vocalic word. That the logos is first imprinted, and that imprint is the writing resource of language, signifies, to be sure, that the logos is not a creative activity, the continuous and full element of the divine word, etc. But one would not have taken a single step outside of metaphysics if all one retained from it were a new motif of return to finitude, of a God's death, etc. It is that conceptuality and those problematics that must be deconstructed. They belong to the ontotheology they contest. Difference is also something other than finitude. Now I have to explain Bergson, why he's talking about Bergson. So first, obviously, clearly Nietzsche is being referenced here with God's death. And the reason that he's invoking Nietzsche, I want to say here, is because the logos itself is not creative, right? Like, it's this internal thing that you speak from. This logocentrism that can apply to Plato, Saussure, Hegel, many. This almost more pure living presence, and Husserl also here. But because it's always there and has a certain indelible mark that cannot be changed or erased, you're entering into a deterministic relationship when you describe things this way at all. There's this idea that whatever you're doing before becomes part of a chain of causality from this logos that determines everything about you. And so you're also implicitly doing a determinism when you accept this certain type of logos, which is funny from a Hegelian perspective, right? As Derrida calling him the master of logocentrism, the best logocentrist or whatever. Hegel's whole thing is absolute freedom through contradictions eliminating themselves, right? But he can never get to this freedom because he's always locked into this determination that comes itself from this idea of the divine word, which is very similar to Nietzsche's criticism of Hegel, where he says moral and autonomous are opposites, right? One cannot be moral and autonomous, referring back, which when he says that in Genealogy of Morals, section 2, and earlier in that section, he's alluding to Hegel's dialectic as part of this moral system, and autonomous here, meaning a certain type of freedom. So to accept this logos is also to deny your own freedom in a way. And Derrida is saying that it's this conceptualization itself that needs to be deconstructed, that he's attacking. Continuing here, unless anybody has any questions or responses to that. I actually recorded a thing on Nietzsche in a Nietzsche reading group the other day that I haven't been able to upload about what I was just talking about, so maybe I'll upload that at some point. According to Saussure, the passivity of speech is first its relationship with language. The relationship between passivity and difference cannot be distinguished from the relationship between the fundamental unconsciousness of language, as rootedness within the language, and the spacing, pause, blank, punctuation, interval in general, which constitutes the origin of signification. It is because language is a form and not a substance that, paradoxically, the activity of speech can and must always draw from it. But if it is a form, it is because in language there are only differences. Spacing. Notice that this word speaks the articulation of space and time, the becoming space of time and the becoming time of space is always the non-perceived, the non-present, and the non-conscious. As such, if one can still use that expression in a non-phenomenological way, for here we pass the very limits of phenomenology, Archie writing as spacing cannot occur as such within the phenomenological experience of a presence. It marks the dead time within the presence of the living presence, within the general form of all presence. Dead time is at work. That is why, once again, in spite of all the discursive resources that the former may borrow from the latter, the thought of the trace will never be confused with a phenomenology of writing. As a phenomenology of the sign in general, a phenomenology of writing is impossible. No intuition can be realized in the place where the whites indeed take on an importance. So here's something I'm sure Sen, who is here right now, will enjoy. I recently have been looking into a type of fish that scientists have discovered, a talking fish, which allow me to elaborate on that they think is strange because it had a particularly large cerebellum, which is an area of the brain typically associated with communication. And what they found is that these fish, because they lived in very murky habitats, had evolved to communicate with electromagnetic waves, right, by producing electrical charges in the water. And the way that they found out that the fish were doing this is by looking for the spaces, right? They would wait. They wanted to see if they were actually communicated, and what they found is that when one fish was talking, the other fish would not be talking. They would wait to hear what that fish would have to say with these electric responses, right? And they've also found this with frogs and other. It's an identifying feature that seems to be found within all forms of communication, right? And what we're talking about right now, this electrical sensing, is neither visual nor auditorial, right? And so here we can see the application of this spacing term, a term created by Derrida here, or he's appropriating the term at the very least in a new way, can be directly applicable to animal communication as well. Because I know Sen often likes to say that there was no animal term, which I agree. This here is all incredibly relevant to animals and animal communication, and not just human communication, not just the human-animal communication, but the non-human animal communication as well. And I think these fish are like an extreme example of that. They also found that when a fish wanted to give a lot of information, when they wanted to quote unquote say a lot, they would take a long pause. There would be a big spacing before they did, right? Before they, as if they were preparing to say a lot. And so this spacing is, this silence, this non-presence is often more important for how we end up coming to conclusions, for instance, the discovery of the idea that these fish speak at all, than the actual speech or content or presence itself is. Which is something that Husserl's phenomenological model, at least, probably Heidegger's as well, can't take up. Because they can't. Because how can there be a medium of pretension or retention towards something that isn't there? There's no, in Heidegger's terminology, there's no being there in the spacing to take up, and yet it seems to constitute the majority of what we might consider communication in the first place. I believe that's what he's talking about here. Continuing, unless anybody wants to say anything about that. Nope. Okay. Perhaps it is now easier to understand why Freud says of the dream work that it is comparable rather to a writing than to a language, and to a hieroglyphic rather than to a phonetic writing. And to understand why Saussure says of language that it is not a function of the speaking subject, all these proportions must be understood with or without the complicity of their authors, as beyond simple reversals of a metaphysics of presence or of conscious subjectivity. Constituting and dislocating it at the same time, writing is other than the subject, in whatever sense it is understood. Writing can never be thought under the category of the subject, in whatever manner it is modified, affecting it with consciousness or unconsciousness. It will send us back, by the entire thread of its history, to the substantiality of a presence unperturbed by accidents, or to the identity of the proper in the presence of self-relationship. And we know that the thread of that history does not run with the borders of metaphysics. To determine an X as a subject is never an operation of a pure convention. It is never an indifferent gesture in relation to writing. I think he's again making I think here he's making an allusion to Deleuze's difference in repetition, which I believe was out at this time for a few years, which itself makes reference to Nietzsche with this idea of a presence unperturbed by accident. How did he put it? Yes, of a presence unperturbed by accidents. So this is the chain. In Nietzsche, this would be the long snapping chain of the will to power, right? Where because there are no truths, only interpretations, a Nietzsche quote, it's possible for there to be a type of accident or forgetting causality or time, or Husserl's time consciousness. And this comes from Hume as well, but I don't want to go too much into this. And so we can these breaks necessarily happen as an accident, right? This is how new errors and new moments in history occur, is because somebody forgets or makes a mistake or misinterprets something, because causality itself is up for interpretation, is the idea. And Deleuze takes us up in difference and repetition, and he uses the word bêtise. And I know that Derrida knows about this because he did a whole lecture on it. And so I think that's what he's alluding to here, in a sense. This Archie presence, or Archie trace, or Archie writing, right? This originary, unperturbed by accident, is what we would have to go back to if we wanted to consider writing. And so it can't come down to a subject, right? Because there is no subject at that time. Because a subjectivity is going to be developed from a movement of difference. And there hasn't been a movement of difference. There hasn't been an opportunity to forget or to have an accident or for there to be a misinterpretation yet. So there's no subject within writing itself, which is, feeds very well into Roland Barthes, although almost certainly in a far more radical way than I think Barthes perhaps would have thought of at the time, in that Derrida has kind of rigorously pre-metaphysically proven that there can't be a subject in writing, and so there cannot be an author function within writing. Which is like a completely insane level of proof for that kind of statement, right? Anyway, continuing. Spacing as writing is the becoming absent and the becoming unconscious of the subject. By the movement of its drift, derivation, the emancipation of the sign constitutes in return the desire of presence. That becoming, or that drift, does not befall the subject which would choose it or would passively let itself be drawn along by it. As the subject's relationship with its own death, this becoming is the constitution of subjectivity. On all levels of life's organization, that is to say, of the economy of death, all graphemes are of a testamentary essence, and the original absence of the subject of writing is also the absence of the thing or the referent. Within the horizontality of spacing, good lord, horizon, I'm assuming he's referring to Husserl's use of the term phenomenological horizon of spacing, which is in fact the precise dimension I have been speaking of so far, and which is not opposed to it as surface opposes depth. It is not even necessary to say that spacing cuts, drops, and causes to drop within the unconscious. The unconscious is nothing without this cadence and before this caesura. This signification is formed only within the hollow of difference, of discontinuity, and of discreteness, of the diversion and the reserve of what does not appear. This hinge, Brichier, of language as writing, this discontinuity could have, at a given moment within linguistics, run up against a rather precious, continuous prejudice. Renouncing it, phonology must indeed renounce all distinctions between writing and the spoken word, and thus renounce not itself, phonology, but rather phonologism. What Jacobson recognizes in this respect is most important for us. Quote, the stream of oral speech, physically continuous, originally confronted the mathematical theory of communication with a situation considerably more involved. C.E. Shannon and Weaver, the mathematical theory of communication. That's the citation he's using here for considerably more involved than in the case of a finite set of discrete constituents as presented by written speech. Linguistic analysis, however, came to resolve oral speech into a finite series of elementary informational units. These ultimate discrete units, the so-called distinctive features, are aligned into simultaneous bundles termed phonemes, which in turn are concatenated into sequences. Thus, form in language has a manifestly granular structure and is subject to a quantal description. End quote. The hinge, Brichier, marks the impossibility that a sign, the unity of a signifier and a signified, be produced within the plenitude of a present and absolute presence. That is why there is no full speech, however much one might wish to restore it by means or without benefit of psychoanalysis. Before thinking to reduce it or to restore the meaning of the full speech which claims to be truth, one must ask the question of meaning and of its origin in difference. Such is the place of a problematic of the trace. Any questions or statements about that section?
So here's another bit that kind of speaks to Derrida possibly having a critique of psychoanalysis, but like within the realm of speech and the spoken and writing. But it doesn't seem clear when crossed with any of the other works that this this critique is there? Question mark.
Derrida has a really weird relationship with psychoanalysis for sure.
Yeah, it's a really unusual relationship that is like I'm not entirely clear if it's like he is criticizing it or if he is accepting certain shortcomings of the methodology or something else.
I mean, if we let the theory speak for itself, right? There is no more radical destruction of Lacan's legacy than what Derrida is doing here. Because his whole work, his whole interest with signification, right, requires there to be like a real, imaginary, and symbolic. But obviously, like Derrida, we've already gone over, is completely opposed to that. And so most of Lacanian psychoanalysis, in light of Derrida, to me at least, seems completely unintelligible and completely useless under a Derridian format, with the exception of one thing. I think this is where what Derrida perhaps likes about psychoanalysis is that even though we're flattening things out, even though we're flattening out this signifier and signified in grammatology, which isn't done by psychoanalysis. So Lacan and other forms of psychoanalytics still describe the relationship between, for instance, the signifier and the signified, right? Because they're interested in this signification, they can still be used to describe the relationship between these two things, even if they think it's hierarchical and Derrida doesn't. That still is useful. And I think that's what he's also saying here.
Okay.
He's saying that there is no full speech, and there's no means to restore it, by which to restore it, or without benefit of psychoanalysis. So he's basically saying, like, if you really want to try and look at this relationship, this full speech, you need to do it psychoanalytically. You need to approach it by this way in which a signification might happen. And then we just have to add the Derridian caveat that there's no hierarchy, right? That there's no, there isn't any special precedence of the real over the symbolic or imaginary or whatever, or vice versa for that matter, because Lacan kind of likes to reverse it, but of course for Derrida that's like equally as heretical. So that is my current explanation for his thoughts on psychoanalysis.
Yeah, I think it makes sense. Yeah. Though that question may come up again at some.
Yeah, it's definitely still weird, but because you would have thought that he would be more clear about this, but he's not. So he just kind of avoids it. And in my head, I kind of want, well, maybe this is psychoanalytic of me in the first place, but Lacan was just such an asshole that Derrida might literally have trauma about being his student and not wanting to criticize him.
Ooh, that would be rough.
So that wouldn't surprise me. But yeah, we'll see. He just doesn't want, he doesn't want Lacan to like see that he's Derrida, see Derrida shitting on him or whatever and complain. All right, continuing here. Why of the trace? What led us to this to the choice of this word? God, you've only used it 100 times already without explaining anything about the word, Derrida. Very nice of you to now explain it, in this moment. We have begun to answer this question, but this question is such and such the nature of my answer, that the place of the one and of the other must constantly be in movement. If words and concepts receive meaning only in sequences of differences, one can justify one's language and one's choice of terms only within a topic, an orientation in space, and a historical strategy. So this is where like the phenomenological reduction seems not so special to Derrida, right? Because he says that we do this with everything. That's the only way in which we can justify language. The justification can therefore never be absolute and definitive. This one explanation here is also a criticism of all of formal logic, right? Because formal logic has these two sections to it. It has validity, which is the idea that a logical formalism follows, so that in and of itself it makes sense, right? There's no internal contradictions. And then it also has soundness, which would mean that externally, what we accept about it is true. So, for instance, we could say a premise might be Socrates is a man, and externally we may say, well, Socrates isn't a man, for instance, right? And so it may be unsound. The old classic, Socrates is a man, all men are mortal. So Socrates is immortal, may be valid, but unsound if we don't think Socrates is a man. And if we do think he's a man, it might be sound and valid. But the problem here is that soundness itself is always never an absolute and definitive justification, and can only be justified within a topic. And so soundness and validity are the same. Soundness is deferred validity. You say something is sound when you don't want to explain why it's valid. And this means that all logical formalisms are farts, right? They are air with no content whatsoever, because the whole approach by which we take towards a logical construction is by taking soundness. You have to take this grounding of soundness, but the problem is that it's just deferred validity. So there's no way for you to construct a logical formalism and get anything out of it other than something like that goes back to a grounding in nothing, in a logicalism itself. And he's just saying that all here in this one tiny paragraph. It corresponds. I'll continue here anyway. And he says the justification can therefore never be absolute and definitive. It corresponds to a condition of forces and translates an historical calculation. Thus, over and above those that we have already defined, a certain number of givens belonging to the discourse of our time have progressively imposed this choice upon me. The word trace must refer itself to a number of contemporary discourses whose force we intend to take into account. Not that we accept them totally, but the word trace establishes the clearest connections with them and thus permits me to dispense with certain developments which have already demonstrated their effectiveness in those fields. Thus, we relate this concept of trace to what is at the center of the latest work of Emmanuel Levinas and his critique of ontology. Levinas reference. Relationship to the eleity as to the alterity of a past that never was and can never be lived in the originary or modified form of presence, reconciled here to a Heideggerian intention, as it is not in Levinas's thought. This notion signifies, sometimes beyond Heideggerian discourse, the undermining of an ontology which, in its innermost course, has determined the meaning of being as presence and the meaning of language as the full continuity of speech. To make enigmatic what one thinks one understands by the words proximity, immediacy, presence, the proximate, proche, the own, prope, and the pre of presence is our final intention in this essay. This deconstruction of presence accomplishes itself through the deconstruction of consciousness, and therefore through the irreducible notion of the trace, spur, as it appears in both Nietzschean and Freudian discourse. And finally, in all scientific fields, notably in biology, this notion seems currently to be dominant and irreducible. So again, the Nietzschean influence comes up again. I'm struggling here with this reference to Levinas and how the fuck I'm supposed to explain Levinas right now for this one reference, when he just is like, oh, and this critique of ontology that Levinas did that I'm sure you're all aware of, which is like a 300-page book that he says nothing about here. Critique of ontology. Yeah, how am I going to even talk about that? This idea that read Levinas. Read Totality and Infinity. That's not what he's referring to here. But yeah, I don't know what else to say. It would take me too long to explain it. I guess I'll just say that for Levinas, when we're engaging with a new thing, I won't say of the other yet, there's an ethical choice that comes prior to metaphysics and ontology. So ontology is being, is a description of the way that things are, right? Or what it means to be. So prior to what it means to be or what a thing is, and also metaphysically, right, the metaphysical constraints that make that possible, there is prior to that also an ethical consideration of whether we choose to take that thing as the other or the same. And so, for instance, anytime something emerges, something new emerges, we can choose to respect it for its otherness and say, you know what, it is different, and I do not fully understand it, and I won't fully understand it, and that's okay. Or we can choose to say, I understand that thing, I know everything about it, and make it the same, right? You relate it to yourself and your own phenomenology. So there's this other, same. It's more like a spectrum than binary. And I think what Derrida is saying, that this movement that Levinas is engaging here in relation to Heideggerian ontology would be happening in the trace for Derrida. That this ethical consideration is rightly pre-metaphysical, pre-ontological, maybe we could say that it's para-metaphysical rather than prior to metaphysics, alongside metaphysics or with metaphysics. That that he's right to place it there because for Derrida, obviously, it belongs in the trace, which is also those things. But I actually think the Levinasian influence in Derrida is very minimal, which is why he doesn't talk about him that much. And also, they were writing at the same time, so whatever. I'll continue here. It's too complicated. I'd have to do like a whole thing on Levinas. Continuing. If the trace archi-phenomenon of memory, which must be thought before the opposition of nature and culture, animality and humanity, etc., belongs to the very movement of signification, then signification is a priori written, whether inscribed or not, in one form or another, in a sensible and spatial element that is called exterior. Archie writing, at first the possibility of the spoken word, then of the graphy in the narrow sense, the birthplace of usurpation, denounced from Plato to Saussure, this trace is the opening of the first exteriority in general. So Levinas's book Totality and Infinity is called an essay on exteriority, even though it's like over several hundred pages or whatever he calls it. So it's an essay. So again, Derrida is connecting this trace to the Levinasian idea of exteriority or the other. The enigmatic relationship of the living to its other, and of an inside to the outside, spacing, which is something that Derrida has had, not in this section, but in the previous section here, the inside is the outside, and the inside and the outside, right? Which, go back to previous episodes for that. The outside spatial and objective exteriority, which we believe we know as the most familiar thing in the world, as familiarity itself, would not appear without the gram, without the difference as temporalization, without the non-presence of the other inscribed within the sense of the present, without the relationship with death as the concrete structure of the living present. Metaphor would be forbidden. The presence-absence of the trace, which one should not even call its ambiguity, but rather its play, for the word ambiguity requires the logic of presence, even when it begins to disobey that logic, carries in itself the problems of the letter and the spirit, of body and soul, and of all the problems whose primary affinity we have recalled. Here, I'm going to ask a question to others here, instead of my usual method of waiting for someone else to say something. And say, what do we think Derrida means by play here? It's the presence absence of the trace, which one would not even call its ambiguity, but rather its play.
The role? It's translating to role for me in my brain, but
Role?
possibly not that.
What if I said that I think it's Nietzschean? I know Suit Posting is here. Resident Nietzschean. What do you think about Nietzsche when he says play, if you're here? The third stage is what I'm thinking of here, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I suppose I'll explain that, because I think that this term play, and Derrida has used it before, is important. So typically for Nietzsche, and this isn't complete by far, but there are three stages to the way in which one lives their life. The first is that of a camel, right? You're taking on the burdens of others, things like religion, institution, family values, societal values, and you don't question them, you take them on as burdens, right? You're the camel. You carry shit. And you do, and that's how you go about doing things metaphysically and ontologically. And then I shouldn't say metaphysically, because obviously Nietzsche hated metaphysics, but whatever. The second stage just seemed to be the lion, and you could say this is like a type of nihilism, where you say, man, fuck the church, fuck society, whatever, I'm the Joker now, whatever, obviously. Not exactly, but and for the problem for the lion is that there's this big dragon he needs to defeat, right? And you'll see this amongst many Marxists, right? Or communists or whatever in general. Capitalism is like the big bad, and they're so concerned with killing the dragon that they're not really free. right? Um, and then the third stage is play, like a child. And this is what Nietzsche sees as the most advanced. And sometimes people don't ever get past any of these stages, right? Sometimes they're a camel forever, sometimes they're a lion forever. But a child at play is the most free because they're not. All they're trying to do is creative. It's just creative. It's for fun. They do things for their own reasons, right? It's just aesthetic. There's no. They're not concerned with societal values. They're not worried about the big dragon. They're just doing their thing. And this may, that may well tie into what they viewed as the dragon before. For instance, you could be, a Marxist who was super, super obsessed with defeating capitalism and always talking about how capitalism needs to be defeated. And then you may eventually grow into somebody that starts to do things like create programs for helping working class people or something like this. Or you may go into certain regimes or things practically in the world because you want to do those things. And this is like a form of play, right? Rather than being obsessed with defeating capitalism on its own, you're actually just like creatively engaging in something that will change the world directly via your own will to power, right? And so when Derrida says that the presence absence of the trace, this enabling of difference, isn't an ambiguity, which is something that people criticize him for a lot, right? He says he tries to just make everything ambiguous, and he says no, actually it's play, right? It's a form of creative rule breaking that isn't. It's what Deleuze and Guattari might call a line of flight, right? If that's more clear for people familiar with that particular tradition. So I actually think that one word is very important, and he uses the term play a lot, and he directly attributes it to Nietzsche in his Nietzsche book, and in here he really talks about the Nietzschean influence of the term trace in the first place, right? So I think this is all super relevant. I don't know if anybody wants to say anything about that before I continue. Okay. All dualisms, all theories of the immortality of the soul or of the spirit, as well as all monisms, spiritualist or materialist, dialectical or vulgar, are the unique theme of a metaphysics whose entire history was compelled to strive towards the reduction of the trace, the subordination of the trace to the full presence summed up in the logos. The humbling of writing beneath a speech, dreaming its plentitude. Such are the gestures required by an ontotheology, determining the archaeological and eschatological meaning of being as presence, as parousia, as life without difference, another name for death, historical monotony, where God's name holds death in check. That is why, if this movement begins its era in the form of Platonism, it ends in infinitist metaphysics. Only infinite being can reduce the difference in presence. In that sense, the name of God, at least as it is pronounced within classical rationalism, is the name of indifference itself. Only a positive infinity can lift the trace, sublimate it. It has recently been proposed that the Hegelian Affabung be translated as sublimation. This translation may be of dubious worth as translation, but the juxtaposition is of interest here. Funnily enough, I think that's what everybody uses now, right? We must not therefore speak of a theological prejudice, functioning sporadically when it is a question of the plentitude of the logos. The logos as the sublimation of the trace is theological. Infinitist theologies are always logocentrisms, whether they are creationisms or not. Spinoza himself said of the understanding, or logos, that it was the immediate infinite mode of the divine substance, even calling it its internal son in the short treatise. It is also, to this epoch, reaching completion with Hegel, with a theory of the absolute concept as logos, that all the non-critical concepts accredited by linguistics belong at least to the extent that linguists must confirm, and how can science avoid it, the Saussurian decree marking out the internal system of language. Again, that psychic imprint we were talking about earlier, that Derrida here is now calling an attempt to bottle up and reduce the trace to make it more manageable, right? And I actually think he's being very critical of Levinas here with his regard to the infinite, where he says that he's basically saying that like this complex relationship and movement of difference, right? And the most stifling thing that you can do to it is to appeal to this Descartesian infinite, of this thing that overflows the phenomenological horizon, which is obviously what Levinas is like basing much of his theory on. Derrida is kind of accusing him of snuffing out play and using it as a node, like a god. This god of infinity is a node of pure indifference. It cannot be related to in any way to the trace as described by Levinas, at least, right? And so he's kind of blinding himself in a way. That's not to say that Derrida is necessarily disagreeing with everything that Levinas said. Should we take that into account? I think we can still do that. There's still a lot of value in what Levinas is saying, but Derrida is cautioning us against applying this to, for instance, as Levinas might, to the face or the other. Continuing here, it is precisely these concepts that permitted the exclusion of writing, image or representation, sensible and intelligible, nature and culture, nature and techniques, etc. They are solidary with all metaphysical conceptuality, and particularly with a naturalist, objectivist, and derivative determination of the difference between outside and inside. And above all, with a vulgar concept of time. We borrow this expression from Heidegger. It designates at the end of being and time a concept of time thought in terms of spatial movement or of the now, and dominating all philosophy from Aristotle's physics to Hegel's logic. This concept, which determines all of classical ontology, was not born out of a philosopher's carelessness or from a theoretical lapse. It is intrinsic to the totality of the history of the Occident, that's the West, of what unites its metaphysics and its techniques. And we shall see it later associated with the linearization of writing and with the linearist concept of speech. This linearism is undoubtedly inseparable from phonologism. It can raise its voice to the same extent that a linear writing can seem to submit to it. Saussure's entire theory of the linearity of the signifier could be interpreted from this point of view. Quote, auditory signifiers have at their command only the dimension of time. Their elements are presented in succession, they form a chain. This feature becomes readily apparent when they are represented in writing. The signifier, being auditory, is unfolded solely in time, from which it gets the following characteristics. A. It represents a span, and B. The span is measurable in a single dimension. It is a line. End quote. It is a point on which Jacobson disagrees with Saussure decisively by substituting for the homogeneousness of the line the structure of the musical staff, the chord in music. What is here in question is not Saussure's affirmation of the temporal essence of discourse, but the concept of time that guides this affirmation and analysis. Time conceived as linear successivity, as consecutivity. This model works by itself and all through the course, but Saussure is seemingly less sure of it in the anagrams. At any rate, its value seems problematic to him, and an interesting paragraph elaborates a question left suspended. Quote, that the elements forming a word follow one another is a truth that would be better for linguistics not to consider uninteresting, because evident, but rather as the truth which gives in advance the central principle of all useful reflections on words. In a domain as infinitely special as the one I am about to enter, It is always by virtue of the fundamental law of the human word in general that a question like that of consecutiveness or non-consecutiveness may be posed. End quote. This linearist concept of time is therefore one of the deepest adherences of the modern concept of the sign to its own history. For at the limit, it is indeed the concept of the sign itself, and the distinction, however tenuous, between the signifying and signified faces that remain committed to the history of classical ontology. The parallelism and correspondence of the faces or the planes change nothing. That this distinction, first appearing in Stoic logic, was necessary for the coherence of a scholastic thematics dominated by infinitist theology, forbids us to treat today's debt to it as a contingency or a convenience. We suggested this at the onset, and perhaps the reasons are clearer now. The signatum always referred, as to its referent, to a res, to a being created, or at any rate first thought and spoken, thinkable and speakable in the eternal present of the divine logos and the specificality in its breath. If it came to relate to the speech of a finite being, created or not, in any case of its intracosmic being, through the intermediarity of a signans, the signatum had an immediate relationship with the divine logos, which thought it within presence, and for which it was not a trace. And for modern linguistics, if the signifier is a trace, the signified is a meaning thinkable in principle within the full presence of an intuitive consciousness. The signified face, to the extent that it is originarily distinguished from the signifying face, is not considered a trace. By rights, it has no need of the signified to be what it is. It is at the depth of this affirmation that the problem of relationships between linguistics and semantics must be posed. This reference to the meaning of a signified thinkable and possible outside of all signifiers remains dependent upon the teleology that we have just evoked. It is thus the idea of the sign that must be deconstructed through a mediation upon writing, which would emerge, as it must, with the undoing, solicitation, of ontotheology, faithfully repeating it in its totality and making it insecure in its most assured evidences. One is necessarily led to this from the moment that the trace affects the totality of the sign in both its faces. That the signified is originarily and essentially, not only for a finite and created spirit, trace, that is always already in the position of the signifier, is the apparently innocent proposition within which the metaphysics of the logos, of presence and consciousness, must reflect upon writing as its death and its resource. End quote. That is it. That's the end of the section. The end of the whole what is it called? Writing before the letter and linguistics and grammatology. And next we'll be starting on chapter 3 of Grammatology as a Positive Science. Does anybody want to talk about the sections that I just read before I talk about what we might be expecting from the next one? Or anything that we went over here today?
So towards the end, he does take up relatively strong disagreement with Levinas, but then again, I haven't read Levinas yet, so I'm not sure.
With regards to the face, yeah, it's the same criticism that he gave earlier, right? Because Levinas considers like the face or the other to be like the same as their relationship to God, and so it's infinite. And so for Levinas, for Derrida, I should say, under Levinas's ideas, every encounter with another person is like throwing away your entire history. Because there is this unreachable, unidentifiable, there's no trace, right, to go back to.
I see.
And so for Derrida, it's kind of like, not only does he think this is wrong, right, rigorously, like he's talked about why he thinks the trace and movement of difference is necessary for language, which Levinas doesn't think that. Levinas has a very different description of what he views as language. But he also views Levinas's attitude as, rather than as it purports to be the most accepting, it's actually the most fascistic to Derrida, in a sense, because it sublimates the entire trace. It takes away all context, right? There's no context for the face. It's absolute. And so it also becomes, for Derrida, a type of human, a certain appeal to human nature.
Okay, I see.
Anyway, in the next section, this is one of my favorite sections in this book of Grammatology, is a positive science. Derrida is going to be attacking Levi-Strauss a lot and his anthropology, which is really bad. So, at least in the thing that he's going to criticize here, and he just talk about some other stuff, and he'll more directly talk about the relationship between the trace and things like the description of facts and logic and the sciences, and why it becomes prior to all, and all of those things, and particularly the problems that he has with logic in general in a lot of cases. Okay, so we will call it here.